The dust kicked up from the main street as people gathered in the town square of Cedar Creek, Montana. It was a hot Tuesday morning in August 1885, and the monthly auction was about to begin. Most folks came to buy livestock, farming tools, or household goods, but today was different. Today, something unthinkable was happening. Mary Thompson sat on a wooden crate near the auction platform, her thin frame shaking with each cough that escaped her lips. The sickness had taken hold of her lungs months ago, and everyone in town knew she didn't have much time left. Her weathered hands clutched a small cloth bag that held everything valuable she owned in this world. Beside her stood 12-year-old Lucy, her granddaughter. The girl's bright blue eyes darted nervously around the crowd, not fully understanding what was about to happen. Her golden hair was neatly braided, and she wore her only good dress, a faded blue cotton that Mary had sewn for her last Christmas. Lucy held her grandmother's free hand tightly, sensing the sadness that hung heavy in the air. "Grandma, why are all these people staring at us?" Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter of the growing crowd. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the child who meant everything to her. How could she explain that in just a few minutes Lucy would be standing on that platform and someone would take her away forever? How could she tell this innocent girl that she was about to lose the only family she had left? "Sweet child," Mary said softly, "you remember what I told you about being brave?" Lucy nodded, though confusion clouded her young face. She remembered the conversation from the night before, when her grandmother had spoken about changes coming and how Lucy would need to be strong. But she still didn't understand why the auctioneer, a stout man named Pete Williams, climbed onto the wooden platform and called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start today's bidding in just a few minutes. As you all know, we have some unusual circumstances today." Near the back of the crowd, a tall man in his 30s watched the scene unfold. James Crawford had ridden into town that morning to buy supplies for his ranch, not expecting to witness something that would change his life forever. He was known throughout the territory as Big Jim, not just for his height but for the size of his heart and his reputation as a fair man. James had built one of the most successful cattle operations in Montana. His Double C ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of the best grazing land in the territory. But success hadn't brought him happiness. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife Catherine and their unborn child during a difficult winter. Since then, he had thrown himself into his work, rarely coming to town except for supplies and business. As he stood there watching Mary Thompson's struggle, memories of his own losses came flooding back. He remembered the helpless feeling of watching someone you love slip away, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. The crowd grew restless as Pete Williams began setting up for the auction. Whispers spread through the gathering as people discussed what they were about to witness. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others understood the desperate situation that had led to this moment. "I heard she owes the doctor nearly $50, one woman murmured to her neighbor. "And there's rent on that little house, too," another added. "Poor Mary's got nowhere to turn. What kind of life will that child have?" Someone else wondered aloud. James found himself moving closer to the platform, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. As he approached, he could see Mary Thompson more clearly. The woman was clearly dying, her skin pale and her breathing labored. But it was the child beside her that captured his attention. Lucy stood with a dignity that seemed beyond her years, though fear flickered in her eyes. There was something about her posture, the way she held her chin up despite her obvious terror, that reminded James of his late wife. Catherine had possessed that same quiet strength. "Folks, let's get started," Pete Williams announced, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. Even he seemed uncomfortable with what was about to happen. "As you all know, Mary Thompson has requested we help her find a suitable arrangement for young Lucy here." Mary slowly stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. She placed her hands on Lucy's shoulders and whispered something in the girl's ear. Whatever she said made Lucy's eyes grow wide with understanding and fear. "No, Grandma," Lucy said, loud enough for several people to hear. "I don't want to go with strangers. I want to stay with you." Mary's composure finally broke and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Sweet girl, you know I would keep you with me if I could. But I can't take care of you anymore, and I need to know you'll be safe." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed this heartbreaking scene. Some women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, while men cleared their throats and looked away. James felt something twist in his chest as he watched the interaction. He thought about his own lonely ranch house, about the empty rooms that echoed with memories of what might have been. He thought about the conversations he'd had with his foreman Miguel about how the big house felt too quiet, too empty. "We'll start the bidding at $10, Pete Williams announced reluctantly. Several hands went up around the crowd. James recognized most of the bidders. There was Tom Murphy, who ran a boarding house and was known for working his help hard. Margaret Foster raised her hand too, but James knew she was struggling to feed her own 4 children. Then there was Ben Carlson, whose reputation with hired help was questionable at best. As the bidding continued, James found himself growing more and more uncomfortable with the situation. These people weren't thinking about what was best for Lucy. They were thinking about getting cheap labor. $25, called out Murphy. 30, countered Mrs. Foster. Lucy looked around at the faces in the crowd, her fear growing more obvious with each bid. She pressed closer to her grandmother, who could barely stand upright. $35, Ben Carlson shouted from across the crowd. James had heard enough. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he stepped forward and called out in his deep, carrying voice, $100. The crowd fell silent. $100 was more money than most of these people saw in several months. It was an amount that ended the bidding immediately and effectively. Pete Williams looked stunned. "Did you say $100, mister Crawford?" "I did," James replied firmly, though his heart was pounding. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't even thought about it. The words had simply come out of him as he watched that frightened child and her dying grandmother. "Going once, going twice," Pete said quickly, looking around to see if anyone else would bid. When no one did, he brought down his gavel. "Sold to James Crawford for $100. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, surprised by this turn of events. James Crawford was known as a fair man, but he was also known as a loner, who kept to himself at his ranch. Mary Thompson looked at James with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She had heard good things about this man, though she had never spoken to him directly. At least Lucy would be going to someone with means, someone who could provide for her. James approached the platform, his boots heavy on the dusty ground. As he got closer, he could see Lucy more clearly. She was small for her age, but there was intelligence in her eyes and the strength that impressed him. She looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Hello, Lucy," he said gently, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "My name is James Crawford. I have a ranch not far from here." Lucy didn't respond, but she didn't back away either. She studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine what kind of person he was. Mary Thompson struggled to her feet and approached James. "Mr. Crawford, I want to thank you. I've heard you're a good man, and I'm grateful that Lucy will be going to someone with a kind heart." James stood up and tipped his hat to the older woman. "Ma'am, I want you to know that Lucy will be well cared for. She have a good home at the Double C." As the crowd began to disperse, James paid Pete Williams the $100 and received the papers that made him Lucy's legal guardian. The weight of what he had just done was beginning to sink in. He had just changed not only his life, but the life of this young girl forever. Lucy stood quietly beside her grandmother, still not fully comprehending that this stranger now controlled her destiny. All she knew was that her world was about to change completely, and she was scared. The wagon ride to the Double C Ranch felt like the longest journey of Lucy's young life. She sat in the back with her small bundle of belongings, watching the town of Cedar Creek disappear behind them. Her grandmother had passed away just hours after the auction, and now Lucy was truly alone in the world except for this stranger who had bought her papers. James guided the horses along the dusty trail, occasionally glancing back at the quiet girl. He could see the fear in her posture, the way she held herself stiff and ready to run, even though there was nowhere to go. He had made this decision impulsively at the auction, and now he was wondering what exactly he was going to do with a 12-year-old girl. "We should be there in about an hour," he called back to her, trying to sound reassuring. Lucy nodded but didn't speak. She hadn't said a word since they left town. As they rode, James found himself thinking about his own childhood. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the youngest of 4 boys. His parents had been strict but loving, and he had always felt secure in his place in the family. This girl had lost everything and everyone she had ever known. How could he possibly make her feel safe? The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached the ranch. Lucy's eyes widened as she saw the sprawling property for the first time. The main house was larger than any building she had ever seen, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Behind it stood a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals filled with horses and cattle. "This is home," James said simply as he helped her down from the wagon. Lucy stood in the dusty yard, clutching her small bundle, overwhelmed by the size of everything around her. In town, she and her grandmother had lived in a tiny 2-room house. This place seemed endless. A Mexican man in his 50s approached them from the barn. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw James, but his expression grew curious when he noticed Lucy. "Miguel, I'd like you to meet Lucy," James said. "She be staying with us from now on." Miguel's kind eyes immediately understood the situation. He had worked for James for 15 years and knew about the loneliness that had settled over his boss since Catherine's death. He also recognized the look of a frightened child when he saw one. "Welcome to the Double C, little one," Miguel said, gently in accented English. "I am Miguel Hernandez. I help run this place." Lucy looked between the 2 men, still unsure of what was expected of her. In town, children who were bought at auction usually ended up working as servants, doing the hardest and dirtiest jobs. She was prepared for that, but something about these 2 men seemed different. "Are you hungry?" James asked. "Maria, Miguel's wife, she cooks for us. She makes the best beef stew in all of Montana." At the mention of food, Lucy's stomach growled loudly. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and the stress of the day had left her feeling weak and dizzy. She nodded slightly, the first real response she had given since leaving town. James led her toward the house, Miguel walking alongside them. "Lucy, I want you to understand something," James said as they reached the porch steps. "You're not here to be a servant. You're here because you need a home, and I have room to provide one." Lucy looked up at him with suspicion. Adults had never spoken to her this way before. In her experience, children were expected to work hard and stay out of the way. The idea that someone would take her in without expecting labor in return seemed impossible. The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. The main room had a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with more books than Lucy had ever seen in one place. Her grandmother had owned 3 books, and Lucy had read each of them dozens of times. "Maria," James called out, "we have a guest for dinner." A plump, motherly woman emerged from what Lucy assumed was the kitchen. She had kind eyes and flour on her apron, and she immediately rushed over when she saw Lucy. "Oh, you poor little thing," Maria said in heavily accented English. "You look like you haven't eaten in days. Come to the kitchen. I have fresh bread and stew ready." Lucy followed Maria to the kitchen, still clutching her bundle. The room was warm and filled with delicious smells. Maria immediately began bustling around, preparing a plate of food that looked like a feast to Lucy's hungry eyes. Sit," Maria insisted, pulling out a chair at the large wooden table. As Lucy ate, she listened to James and Miguel talking in low voices in the next room. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard Miguel saying something about the girl needs time and patience. She wondered if they were already regretting bringing her here. After dinner, James showed Lucy to a bedroom on the 2nd floor. It was larger than the entire house she had shared with her grandmother, with a real bed covered in soft quilts, a dresser, and even a small desk by the window. "This was my wife's sister's room when she visited," James explained. "It's yours now for as long as you want it." Lucy set her bundle on the bed and looked around the room in amazement. There were curtains on the windows, a rug on the floor, and even a small mirror on the dresser. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, speaking for the first time since the auction, "what do you want?" "Me to do?" James was surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "For work," Lucy clarified. "What jobs do you want me to do?" "I can cook some, and I'm good at cleaning. I can help with animals, too." James felt his heart break a little at her words. This child was so young, yet she was already resigned to a life of hard labor. "Lucy, I don't want you to worry about work right now. You've been through a lot today. Why don't you rest, and we'll talk about everything tomorrow?" Lucy nodded, but she remained suspicious. In her experience, adults always wanted something from children. She couldn't understand why this man would spend so much money on her and then not put her to work immediately. That night, Lucy lay in the soft bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. She had never slept in such a comfortable bed, but she couldn't relax. Everything felt too good to be true. She thought about her grandmother, who was now buried in the town cemetery. Mary Thompson had been the only family Lucy had ever known, and now she was gone forever. The grief hit her like a wave, and she buried her face in the pillow to muffle her sobs. Down the hall, James lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the muffled sounds of Lucy crying, and he wanted to go comfort her, but he didn't know how. He had never been around children much, and he wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. The next morning, Lucy woke before dawn, as she always had when living with her grandmother. She dressed quickly and crept downstairs, intending to start on whatever chores needed doing. She found James already in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. "Good morning," he said, looking surprised to see her up so early. "Did you sleep well?" Lucy shrugged. "Where do you want me to start working?" James set down his newspaper and studied her face. She looked tired, and there were traces of tears on her cheeks from the night before. He realized that this child had probably never had a day in her life when she wasn't expected to work. "Lucy, sit down for a minute," he said gently. "I want to explain something to you." Reluctantly, Lucy sat at the table across from him. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes downcast, the posture of a child who had learned to expect the worst. "You're not here to be my servant," James said carefully. "You're here because you needed a home, and I have one to offer. Yes, everyone on the ranch has responsibilities, but you're just a child. Your main job is to learn and grow and be safe." Lucy looked up at him with confusion. "But why would you want me here if I can't work?" The question revealed so much about how this child saw her own worth. James chose his words carefully. "Lucy, you have value just because you're you. You don't have to earn your place here by working yourself to exhaustion." Before Lucy could respond, Maria bustled into the kitchen and immediately began preparing breakfast. "Good morning, little one," she said cheerfully. "Did you sleep in that beautiful bed?" Lucy nodded, still processing what James had told her. Could it really be true that she was welcome here without having to work like an adult? It seemed too good to believe. Over breakfast, James explained what life at the ranch was like. Miguel managed the day-to-day operations with the help of several ranch hands. Maria took care of the house and cooking. James handled the business side of things and made the important decisions. "Where do I fit?" Lucy asked quietly. "Wherever you want." "To fit," James replied. "If you're interested in the horses, Miguel can teach you about them. If you like books, I have plenty you can read. If you want to help Maria in the kitchen, I'm sure she'd welcome the company." For the first time since the auction, Lucy felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this place could become home. 3 months had passed since Lucy arrived at the Double C Ranch, and slowly, very slowly, she was beginning to believe that this might actually be home. The first few weeks had been difficult. She would wake up every morning expecting James to tell her it was all a mistake, that she needed to pack her things and leave. But each day he would greet her with the same patient kindness, and gradually her guard began to lower. It was on a crisp October morning that Lucy discovered her gift with horses. She had been walking near the main corral when she noticed a commotion. Several ranch hands were trying to work with a wild Mustang that James had brought in the week before. The horse was magnificent, with a coat the color of dark chocolate and a white blaze down his face, but he was terrified and angry. "Easy there, boy," called out Tom, one of the experienced hands, but the horse reared up, his hooves flashing dangerously close to the man's head. Lucy found herself drawn to the fence, watching the scene unfold. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, and she could see the trembling in his legs despite his aggressive posturing. She had seen that same look in her own reflection many times over the past few months. "He's scared," she said softly, though she didn't realize she had spoken. Aloud. Miguel, who was standing nearby supervising the work, heard her comment. "What did you say, little one?" Lucy blushed, embarrassed to have drawn attention to herself. "Nothing, sorry. I just thought ... the horse looked scared more than mean." Miguel studied her face, then looked back at the struggling Mustang. "You think so? Tell me what you see." Lucy hesitated. Adults didn't usually ask for her opinions about anything, but something in Miguel's encouraging expression made her continue. "Look at his ears. They keep flicking back and forth. And see how he keeps looking toward the gate? He's not trying to hurt anyone. He just wants to get away." Miguel's eyebrows rose in surprise. This 12-year-old girl had just demonstrated more understanding of horse behavior than some men who had worked with animals for years. "James," Miguel called out, "come here. Lucy has something to say about this horse." James approached the fence, wiping sweat from his forehead. The Mustang had been giving them trouble for days, and he was beginning to think the animal might be too wild to train. "What is it?" James asked, looking between Miguel and Lucy. Lucy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to interrupt the work. I just noticed something about the horse." "Go on," James encouraged gently. Lucy took a deep breath and pointed toward the Mustang. "He's not really fighting you. Look at his body language. When a horse really wants to fight, he'll pin his ears back flat and his eyes get hard. This one keeps his ears moving and his eyes are soft. He's just terrified." James studied the horse more carefully, seeing it through Lucy's eyes. She was right. The animal's aggression was defensive, not offensive. "What would you suggest?" James asked, genuinely curious about her thoughts. Lucy was shocked that he was asking her opinion about something so important, but she thought carefully before answering. "Maybe if everyone stepped back and gave him more space? Let him see that no one's trying to trap him, and maybe speak softer. Loud voices probably remind him of danger." James looked at Miguel, who nodded approvingly. "Let's try it," James said to the ranch hands. "Everyone back up and keep your voices down." As the men stepped away from the corral, the change in the horse was immediate. His head lowered slightly and his rigid posture began to relax. "Well, I'll be," Tom muttered. The little lady was right. Over the following days, James found himself asking Lucy to observe other horses that were giving them trouble. Her insights were consistently accurate, and her gentle approach seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. It became clear that she had a natural gift for understanding horses in a way that couldn't be taught. "Would you like to learn to ride?" James asked her one evening as they watched the sunset from the porch. Lucy's eyes lit up with excitement, but then her expression grew cautious. "Is that something I'm allowed to do?" The question broke James's heart. Even after months at the ranch, Lucy still asked permission for things that should have been natural rights for any child. "Lucy, you're not a servant here. You're part of this family. Of course you can learn to ride." The next morning, Miguel began teaching Lucy the basics of horsemanship. She was a quick learner, fearless but respectful of the animals. Within weeks, she was riding confidently around the ranch, often helping with simple tasks, like moving cattle from one pasture to another. But it wasn't just with horses that Lucy began to shine. James had always been an educated man, having attended university back east before inheriting the ranch from his uncle. His house contained hundreds of books, and he noticed Lucy looking at them longingly. "Can you read?" he asked one evening. Lucy nodded. "Grandma taught me. I love reading, but we only had a few books." James stood up and walked to one of the bookshelves. Well, you have hundreds now. Pick anything you like. Lucy approached the shelves with the reverence of someone entering a church. Her fingers traced the spines of books on history, literature, science, and philosophy. She pulled out a volume of poetry and opened it carefully. "I've never seen so many books in one place," she whispered. That evening marked the beginning of a new routine. After dinner, Lucy and James would sit in his study, reading together. Sometimes she would read aloud, her young voice bringing new life to familiar passages. Other times, James would explain difficult concepts or share stories about the authors. Lucy proved to have a sharp mind and an endless curiosity. She asked thoughtful questions that often surprised James with their insight. Their evening discussions became the highlight of both their days. "You're very smart," James told her one night as she struggled through a particularly challenging passage about astronomy. Lucy looked up from the book, surprised. "Grandma used to say that, but I thought she was just being nice." "Your grandmother was right. You have a gift for learning, just like you have a gift with horses." As Lucy's confidence grew, so did her curiosity about the world beyond the ranch. She began asking James about his life before Montana, about the places he had traveled, and the things he had learned. In turn, she began sharing memories of her life with her grandmother, stories that were both sad and beautiful. "Grandma always said she wished she could have given me more," Lucy said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars. "She gave you the most important things," James replied. "She taught you to read, to think, to be kind. Those are gifts that no amount of money can buy." The townspeople began to notice the changes in Lucy when she occasionally accompanied James on trips to Cedar Creek. The frightened, silent girl from the auction had become a confident young person who could discuss horses with the local veterinarian and recommend books to the schoolteacher, but not everyone approved of the situation. Some whispered that it wasn't proper for a single man to be raising a young girl, especially one who wasn't his blood relative. Others criticized James for spoiling someone who should be grateful just to have a roof over her head. Lucy overheard some of these comments during a trip to the general store. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, was speaking to another woman near the fabric counter. "It's not natural," Mrs. Peterson was saying. "That girl should be working as a servant, not gadding about on horses and acting like she's quality folk." James Crawford has always been odd, the other woman replied. "Living alone out there, and now taking in a girl from the auction like she's his own daughter." Lucy felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She had been so happy at the ranch that she had almost forgotten how she had arrived there. The comments reminded her that in many people's eyes, she would always be the girl who was sold at auction. That evening, Lucy was quieter than usual during dinner. James noticed her subdued mood and asked if something was wrong. "Do you ever regret bringing me here?" Lucy asked suddenly. James set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" Lucy hesitated, then told him about the conversation she had overheard in town. As she spoke, she could see anger flash in James's eyes, but his voice remained calm when he responded. "Lucy, there will always be people who don't understand kindness. When they see it, they can't imagine helping someone without expecting something in return, so they assume there must be some hidden motive. But what if they're right? What if people think badly of you because of me?" James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I don't care what people think. You belong here, and that's all that matters. You've brought more joy to this house than it's seen in years." That night, Lucy lay in her comfortable bed thinking about James's words. She realized that somewhere along the way, without her even noticing, the Double C Ranch had stopped feeling like a place she was staying temporarily. It had become home, and James had become the father she had never known she needed. The next morning, she woke up with a new sense of purpose. She had found her place in this world, and she was determined to prove that James's faith in her was justified. She had gifts to develop and a future to build, and for the first time in her life, she believed that future could be bright. 2 years had passed since the auction, and Lucy was now 14 years old. She had grown taller and more confident. her golden hair often braided back as she worked with the horses or spent hours in James's study reading medical texts about animal care. The ranch had prospered under James's management, and Lucy had become an integral part of the operation, though few people outside the Double C knew just how important her contributions had become. It was a warm spring morning when the telegram arrived that would change everything. James was checking fence repairs in the north pasture when Miguel rode up with the yellow paper in his hand, his face grim. "What is it?" James asked, taking the telegram and reading it quickly. His expression darkened as he read the message twice. "Bad news?" Miguel asked, though he could already tell from James's reaction. "My brother Robert is coming from San Francisco. He'll be here next week with his family." Miguel knew enough about James's family history to understand why this was troubling news. Robert Crawford was James's older brother, a successful banker who had always resented James's choice to move west and work the land. The two brothers had barely spoken in the past 5 years. Not since Robert had tried to convince James to sell the ranch and move back to civilization after Catherine's death. "How long will they stay?" Miguel asked. "The telegram doesn't say." But knowing Robert, he wouldn't make the trip unless he had something important to discuss. That evening, James broke the news to Lucy during their usual study time. She looked up from the veterinary book she had been reading, immediately sensing his troubled mood. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "My brother Robert is coming to visit with his wife and son. They'll be here next week." Lucy had heard James mention his brother before, though never in particularly warm terms. "Are you happy about that?" James considered how to answer honestly without worrying her unnecessarily. "Robert and I don't see eye to eye on many things. He's a city man who doesn't understand ranch life. I'm just concerned that he might not understand our situation here." "What do you mean?" Lucy asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. "He might not understand why I've taken you in, or how important you've become to this place. People like Robert think everything should fit into neat little boxes, and our family doesn't fit any box he'd recognize." Lucy felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had been so happy and secure at the ranch that she had almost forgotten how unusual their arrangement was in the eyes of the world. "Will he try to make me leave?" James reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers. "I won't let that happen. This is your home, and I'm your guardian. Robert has no say in that." But even as James spoke the reassuring words, Lucy could see the worry in his eyes. She had learned to read his expressions over the past 2 years, and she knew he was more concerned than he was letting on. The following week, a fancy carriage pulled up to the ranch house, looking completely out of place among the practical wagons and horses. Robert Crawford stepped down first, a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit that was already gathering dust from the journey. He was shorter than James, but carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being the most important person in any room. Behind him came his wife, a thin woman named Victoria, who looked around the ranch with obvious distaste, holding a lace handkerchief to her nose as if the smell of horses and cattle was offensive. Their son, a boy about Lucy's age named Charles, emerged last. Looking bored and superior, James walked out to greet them, his jaw set in a polite but stiff expression. Lucy watched from the porch, staying back as James had suggested, but close enough to hear the conversation. "Robert," James said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the Double C?" "Little brother," Robert replied, shaking hands briefly. "The place looks ... He paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic word. "Rustic?" "It's a working ranch," James replied evenly. "Come inside. Maria has prepared rooms for you." As the family gathered their luggage, Lucy heard Victoria whisper to her husband, "Is that the girl?" She was staring directly at Lucy with undisguised curiosity and disapproval. "We'll discuss it later," Robert whispered back, but his tone made Lucy's blood run cold. That first dinner was awkward and tense. Victoria complained about the simple food, despite Maria's excellent cooking. Charles sat silently, picking at his meal and looking around the dining room as if he were visiting a museum of primitive life. Robert, meanwhile, peppered James with questions about the ranch's finances, land holdings, and future plans. Lucy noticed that he spoke about the ranch as if he had some stake in its success, which seemed odd since James had told her that Robert had never shown any interest in the property before. "And who is this young lady?" Victoria finally asked, gesturing toward Lucy with her fork. "This is Lucy," James said simply. "She's part of our family here." "Part of your family?" Robert's eyebrows rose. "I understood she was purchased at an auction 2 years ago." Lucy felt her cheeks burn with shame at the blunt way he said it, as if she were a piece of livestock rather than a person. "Lucy needed a home, and I provided one," James replied, his voice taking on a warning edge. "How charitable of you," Victoria said in a tone that suggested charity was not necessarily a virtue. "But surely at her age she should be in a proper school, learning appropriate skills for her station in life." "Her station?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "Well, yes," Robert interjected. "She's an orphan from the auction block. There are institutions designed specifically for children like her, places where she can learn useful trades and be properly supervised." Lucy felt the room spinning around her. These people, James's own family, were talking about her as if she weren't sitting right there. Worse, they were talking about sending her away to some kind of institution. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," James said, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "Lucy isn't going anywhere. She's happy here, and she's part of this family." "James, be reasonable," Robert said, leaning forward. "You're a single man raising a teenage girl who isn't related to you. People talk. It looks improper." "I don't care how it looks." "Well, you should care," Victoria chimed in. "We've heard the gossip even in San Francisco. People are saying all sorts of things about your arrangement here." Lucy couldn't take any more. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," she said quietly, and fled from the room. She ran outside into the cool evening air, her heart pounding with fear and anger. Everything she had built here, everything she had come to love and depend on, was suddenly under attack by these strangers who claimed to be family. James found her a few minutes later, sitting on the porch steps with her knees drawn up to her chest. He sat down beside her without saying anything for a moment. "They want me gone," Lucy said finally. "I know. Are you going to send me away?" James turned to look at her, his expression fierce. "Never. Not ever. This is your home, and I'm your family. Nothing Robert or Victoria says will change that." "But what if they're right? What if it does look improper? What if people really are talking? Lucy, look at me." James waited until she met his eyes. "In 2 years, you've become the daughter I never had. You've brought joy and purpose to this ranch in ways that have nothing to do with work. You've made me remember what it feels like to have a real family. No amount of gossip or pressure from anyone will make me give that up." Lucy felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but for the first time since Robert's family had arrived, they were tears of relief rather than fear. "What are we going to do?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully in the fading light. "We're going to fight for our family," he said finally, "and we're going to win." The next morning brought news that would make their fight even more complicated. Robert had spent the night researching legal precedents, and he had discovered something that could change everything. The papers James had received at the auction gave him guardianship over Lucy, but they weren't adoption papers. Legally, she was still considered an indentured servant, and Robert believed he had found a way to challenge James's authority over her future. As Lucy helped Miguel with the morning feeding, she noticed Robert and Victoria deep in conversation, near their carriage, pointing toward the main house and then toward her. Whatever they were planning, she could tell it wasn't good. The battle for her future was about to begin, and Lucy wasn't sure who would win. The territorial judge arrived on a dusty Tuesday morning, just as Robert had requested. Judge William Morrison was a fair man who traveled the circuit handling legal matters across Montana Territory. His weathered face and kind eyes had seen every type of case imaginable, but this one was unusual even by frontier standards. Lucy sat on the porch steps, watching as the judge's wagon pulled up to the house. Her stomach was twisted in knots, and she had barely slept for 3 nights. Today would decide her future, and she felt powerless to influence the outcome. James emerged from the house, his best shirt pressed and his hair neatly combed. He had spent the morning pacing around his study, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Behind him came Robert, looking confident and self-satisfied, carrying a folder full of legal documents he had prepared. "Your Honor," James said, extending his hand to help the judge down from his wagon. "Thank you for making the trip out here." Judge Morrison shook James's hand firmly. "Mr. Crawford, I understand we have a complex situation to sort out." "Indeed we do," Robert interjected, stepping forward. "Your Honor, I'm Robert Crawford, James's brother. I've requested this hearing because I'm concerned about the welfare of a minor child." Lucy felt her heart sink as she listened to Robert's tone. He sounded so official, so certain of his position. How could she and James possibly stand against that kind of confidence? The hearing took place in James's study, with Lucy, Miguel, and Maria present as witnesses. Victoria and Charles remained outside, though Lucy could see them through the window. Watching the proceedings with interest, Judge Morrison opened a thick ledger and dipped his pen in ink. "Let's start with the basic facts. Miss Lucy Thompson was placed for indenture at a public auction 2 years ago, and Mr. James Crawford purchased her papers for the sum of $100. Is this correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied. "And, what has been the nature of this arrangement since then?" Robert spoke up before James could answer. "Your Honor, my brother has treated this girl as if she were his adopted daughter rather than an indentured servant. While this might seem kind, it's actually created an improper situation that could damage both their reputations." Judge Morrison turned to James. "How do you respond to that?" James straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, when I bought Lucy's papers, I had every intention of providing her with honest work in exchange for room and board. But it quickly became clear that she needed more than just a job. She needed a family." "The law is clear about indenture arrangements," Robert continued. "The child should be learning practical skills and contributing to the household through appropriate labor. Instead, my brother has her reading books, riding horses, and acting as if she has the same status as a blood relative." Lucy listened to Robert's words with growing anger. He made her life at the ranch sound like something shameful, when it had been the happiest time of her life. Judge Morrison looked at Lucy directly. "Young lady, I'd like to hear from you. How have you been treated in this household?" Lucy stood up, her legs shaking slightly. This was her chance to speak for herself, and she knew she had to find the right words. "Your Honor, Mr. Crawford saved my life. When my grandmother died, I had nothing and no one. He could have put me to work in the kitchen or the barn, but instead he gave me a real home." "But surely you understand," Robert interrupted, "that there are proper institutions where orphan children can receive appropriate education and training for their future roles in society." Lucy felt a flash of anger at his condescending tone. "With respect, sir, what role would that be? To spend my life as a servant because I was poor? Mr. Crawford has taught me that my worth isn't determined by where I came from." Judge Morrison raised his hand to quiet the room. "Let me ask this directly, Miss Thompson. Do you wish to remain here at the ranch?" "More than anything," Lucy replied without hesitation. "This is my home. These people are my family." "Even though you have no legal claim to that status?" Robert pressed dot before Lucy could answer. James stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a formal request. I want to adopt Lucy as my legal daughter." The room fell silent. Even Robert looked stunned by this announcement. "Adoption?" Judge Morrison repeated. "That's a significant step, Mr. Crawford. Are you certain about this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," James replied. "Lucy has been my daughter in every way that matters for 2 years. I want to make it legal." Robert recovered from his surprise quickly. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of impulsive decision that proves my point. My brother is a bachelor living alone on a remote ranch. Surely there are more suitable families who could provide a proper upbringing for this child." "I disagree," came a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Miguel standing there, hat in hand. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Morrison nodded. "Go ahead." Miguel stepped into the room, his weathered hands clutching his hat. "I have worked for Mr. James for 15 years. I watched him grieve when he lost his wife. I watched him become lonely and sad. Then Lucy came here, and I watched him come back to life." Miguel's English was accented but clear as he continued. "This girl, she has a gift with horses that I have never seen. She can calm the wildest Mustang with just her voice. And she is smart, very smart. Mr. James teaches her every night, and she learns faster than any child I have known." "That's all very touching," Robert said dismissively, "but it doesn't address the fundamental impropriety of the situation." "What is improper," Miguel said firmly, "is breaking up a family that works. Lucy is happy here. Mr. James is happy. The ranch prospers because they work together. Why would you destroy something so good?" Judge Morrison made notes in his ledger, then looked up at James. "Mr. Crawford, adoption is a permanent legal arrangement. If I approve this, Lucy would inherit everything you own if something happened to you. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" "I am," James said without hesitation. "And Miss Thompson, if you were legally adopted, you would take the Crawford name. You would be James's heir. Do you understand what that means?" Lucy felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. She had gone from being an auction item to potentially becoming an heiress, but more important than any inheritance was the chance to truly belong somewhere. "I understand, Your Honor, and I want that more than anything." Robert made one last attempt. "Your Honor, I must protest. This decision is being made emotionally rather than rationally. Surely the child's best interests would be served by placement with a traditional family structure." Judge Morrison closed his ledger and stood up. "Mr. Robert Crawford, I've heard your concerns and I understand your position. However, I've also seen the evidence before me. This child is clearly thriving in this environment. She's educated, confident, and loved. Mr. James Crawford has provided her with opportunities that she would never have received in an institution or as an indentured servant." Lucy held her breath as the judge continued. "Furthermore, the bond between them is obvious and genuine. I've presided over many adoption cases, and I can tell when a family is real, regardless of how it was formed." Robert's face was turning red. "But the impropriety, the only impropriety I see," Judge Morrison interrupted, "is the suggestion that this child should be torn away from a loving home because it doesn't fit conventional expectations." Lucy felt tears streaming down her face as the judge turned to James. Double quotes, "Mr. Crawford, I hereby approve your petition for adoption. Lucy Thompson will legally become Lucy Crawford, with all the rights and privileges of a natural-born daughter." The room erupted in celebration. Maria rushed in from the kitchen where she had been listening, wrapping Lucy in a fierce hug. Miguel grinned broadly and shook James's hand. Even some of the ranch hands who had gathered outside whooped with joy. Robert stormed out of the house with Victoria and Charles, clearly furious at the outcome. But Lucy barely noticed their departure. She was too overwhelmed by the realization that she finally truly belonged somewhere. 5 years later, Lucy Crawford stood in her wedding dress in the same study where Judge Morrison had approved her adoption. At 19, she had grown into a confident young woman who managed the horse breeding operation at the Double C Ranch. Her husband-to-be was Dr. Thomas Mitchell, a young veterinarian who had come to the territory to work with livestock and had fallen in love with both the land and the remarkable woman who understood animals better than anyone he had ever met. James walked her down the aisle that had been set up in the pasture overlooking the mountains. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes were bright with pride and happiness. As he placed Lucy's hand in Thomas's, he whispered, "Your grandmother would be so proud of the woman you've become." After the ceremony, as guests celebrated with music and dancing, Lucy found a quiet moment with James on the porch where they had shared so many conversations over the years. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction?" she asked. James smiled. "Every day. It was the day my real life began." "Mine too," Lucy agreed. You didn't just give me a home that day. You gave me a future, a family, and the chance to become who I was meant to be. As the sun set over the Double C Ranch, Lucy looked out at the land that had shaped her, surrounded by the people who loved her.